There was a soft murmur in the courtroom, but what everyone truly felt was a strange tension, as if everyone knew that today was not just about a verdict, but about a secret that was about to be exposed. In the front row, a woman sat with a slight smile, glancing around calmly. Her smile carried confidence, arrogance, and a little bit of false certainty. It was not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who believed someone else had already fallen. If you believe that power in court comes from money and show-off, do not skip this story, because today, the meaning of that smile is about to change completely. You are watching Silent Queen Stories, where silence and truth speak the final words. Before the story moves forward, a small request. Please like this video and subscribe to Silent Queen Stories. Stories like this reach you only because of your support. And believe me, what happens next is absolutely not something you want to miss. That woman's name was Vivian. In court papers, she was labeled the other woman, but she saw herself as something much more. She wore an expensive dress, perfect makeup, and a smile that clearly said the game was already over. For her, this case was not just a legal process, it was her moment. Standing beside her was a man named Daniel, the company's CEO, powerful, well-known, and today, slightly nervous. But Vivian did not care. To her, Daniel was a bridge leading to a new life, a new identity, a new power. On the other side of the courtroom, another woman sat quietly. Simple clothes, no makeup, no expression, as if she was not even part of the story. But the real story began right there. Her name was Eleanor, Daniel's wife. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, her eyes steady but her voice completely silent. People looking at her assumed she had already lost, that she had lost everything. But silence does not always mean defeat. The judge lifted the gavel. "We will proceed," he said. Vivian's smile grew deeper. Daniel's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my client is seeking a clean separation. The marriage has been over for years." Vivian nodded slightly, as if she already knew this would be said. Then Vivian's lawyer spoke. "My client believes she has been unfairly portrayed. She only stood by a man who was already emotionally free." Vivian glanced toward Eleanor. There was challenge in her eyes. Eleanor said nothing. Vivian took that silence as the strongest proof of her victory. She smiled faintly and straightened in her seat, as if only the final decision remained. Some people in the courtroom looked at Eleanor with pity, some admired Vivian, and some were simply enjoying the drama. The judge turned to Daniel. "Mr. Daniel, do you confirm these statements?" Daniel looked at Eleanor for a brief moment, then looked away. "Yes, Your Honor." Vivian pressed her smile. The judge then looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Daniel, would you like to respond?" The entire courtroom went silent. Eleanor stood up slowly. Everyone thought she would finally speak, maybe cry, maybe explain herself. But she said only one thing. "No, Your Honor." Vivian's smile widened. The courtroom believed the story was over, but the story was only beginning. The judge looked down at the papers, then back at Vivian's lawyer. "One last clarification," he said. Vivian sat up straighter. The judge asked a question no one expected. "Before we proceed, can someone clarify one thing for the court?" The judge lifted his eyes. "Who actually owns the company?" Vivian's smile froze. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. It was simple, direct, and dangerous. Who actually owns the company? Vivian's smile stayed frozen, like her face had forgotten how to move. For the first time since the hearing began, she did not know how to react. She glanced sideways at Daniel, expecting him to answer, to take control like he always did. Daniel cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I am the CEO of the company." The judge nodded slightly. "I did not ask who runs the company," he replied. "I asked who owns it." A quiet shift moved through the courtroom. People leaned forward. Pens paused mid-air. Vivian's lawyer stood up quickly. "Your Honor, my client believes this question is outside the scope of—" The judge raised his hand. "Ownership is never outside the scope," he said calmly. Vivian crossed her legs and forced a soft smile back onto her face. She whispered to Daniel, "Relax. This is just a formality." But Daniel did not look relaxed. He looked at the judge again. "The company is privately held," he said. "I founded it." The judge glanced at the documents in front of him. "Founded, yes," he said, "but ownership can change." Daniel hesitated. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. On the other side of the courtroom, Eleanor sat quietly, her expression unchanged. Her hands were still folded in her lap. She did not look at Vivian. She did not look at Daniel. She looked straight ahead, as if she already knew where this was going. Vivian noticed, and for the first time that silence irritated her. She leaned toward her lawyer and whispered, "Why is she so calm?" Her lawyer didn't answer. The judge flipped through another file. "Mr. Daniel," he said, "according to these records, the majority shares of the company are not registered under your name." The courtroom reacted instantly. Low murmurs, raised eyebrows, confused glances. Vivian's smile cracked. "That's impossible," she said out loud before she could stop herself. Everyone turned to look at her. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Vivian," he said, "please allow your counsel to speak for you." Vivian nodded stiffly, lips pressed together. Daniel's lawyer stood again, visibly tense. "Your Honor, there may be a misunderstanding. My client's company structure is complex." The judge looked up. "Complex structures still have clear owners." He turned another page. "These shares are held under a private trust." Vivian leaned forward. "Whose trust?" she asked, unable to hide the edge in her voice. The judge did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Daniel," he said, "you've chosen not to speak so far." Eleanor remained seated. "Yes," the judge continued, "but your name appears several times in these documents." Vivian's breath caught. "What?" she whispered. Daniel turned sharply toward Eleanor. "What is this?" Eleanor finally looked up. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady. "It's exactly what it looks like." Vivian laughed nervously. "Don't be dramatic. You barely showed up to company events." Eleanor looked at her, unbothered. "Ownership doesn't require applause." The courtroom fell silent again. The judge leaned forward. For clarity, he said, "This trust was established years ago, long before these proceedings." Daniel's face drained of color. "Why would she?" Eleanor did not raise her voice. "Because someone had to protect what we built." Vivian stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Daniel promised me." She stopped. Too late. Every eye in the room locked onto her. The judge's expression hardened. "Promised you what, Miss Vivian?" Vivian swallowed. Daniel said nothing. Eleanor said nothing. The silence now belonged to a different person, and Vivian could feel it. For the first time, the smile she had worn so confidently felt heavy, uncomfortable, and very, very fragile. Vivian slowly sat back down, but the confidence she walked in with was gone. Her posture stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She tried to hide it, but the room could feel the shift. Daniel leaned toward Eleanor, his voice low and sharp. "You did this without telling me?" Eleanor didn't look at him. "You never asked." "That's not the point," he snapped. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Daniel," he said, "this court is interested in facts, not personal arguments." Daniel straightened, swallowing hard. The judge continued, "The trust holding the majority ownership is legally binding, and according to these records, Mrs. Daniel is listed as the primary beneficiary." Vivian shook her head slowly. "No," she muttered. "That can't be right." She looked at Daniel, panic creeping into her eyes. "You said the company was yours." Daniel didn't answer. Vivian laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow. "So what? Even if her name is on paper, Daniel runs everything. Everyone knows that." Eleanor finally turned her head toward Vivian. Her voice remained calm. "Running something and owning it are not the same." Vivian clenched her jaw. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Eleanor met her gaze evenly. "No, I'm just done explaining." The judge leaned back slightly. "Mrs. Daniel," he said, "did you establish this trust on your own?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" She paused for a moment. Not because she was unsure, but because she chose her words carefully. Because I believed in the company, she said, and because I believed in my husband, even when I shouldn't have. The room stayed quiet. Daniel stared at her, his voice breaking. You planned this. Eleanor shook her head. I prepared. There's a difference. Vivian stood again, her control slipping fast. So you're saying you're the victim now? She snapped. You stayed silent while he and I... The judge cut her off. Miss Vivian, control yourself. Vivian exhaled sharply, trying to steady her breathing. The judge looked down at the files once more. Mrs. Daniel, he said, these documents show that you also funded several of the company's early expansions. Vivian's eyes widened. You told me you built this from nothing, she said to Daniel. Daniel looked away. Eleanor spoke quietly. I didn't fund it for recognition. I funded it so it wouldn't fail. Vivian let out a bitter laugh. So all this time, you were just waiting? Eleanor shook her head. No, I was hoping I wouldn't need to speak at all. That answer landed harder than anything else. The judge folded his hands. Miss Vivian, he said, you entered this court believing the outcome was settled. Vivian's face tightened. But courts, the judge continued, have a way of uncovering what confidence tries to hide. Vivian looked around the room. The audience no longer admire. Her. Their expressions had changed. Curiosity, doubt, judgment. She felt exposed. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quiet. Why didn't you tell me? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Because you stopped listening a long time ago. Silence filled the courtroom. Not awkward, not empty, clear. And for the first time since the trial began, Vivian understood something she had never considered. The smile she brought into court had never been power. It had only been assumption, and assumptions were starting to fall apart. Vivian took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, trying to pull herself back together. She had not come this far to lose control in front of everyone. If the ground was shifting, she would shift with it. Your Honor, she said carefully, forcing her voice to sound composed, ownership on paper doesn't tell the whole story. Daniel built this company with his vision. Everyone knows that. The judge looked at her calmly. Vision does not override law. Vivian pressed her lips together. But influence matters, authority matters. Eleanor watched quietly. The judge turned back to the documents. Mrs. Daniel, he said, these records also show that you held veto authority over major decisions. Daniel looked up sharply. What? Eleanor's voice was steady. You gave it to me. You said you trusted me. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. That was years ago. Yes, Eleanor replied, before you stopped seeing me as a partner. Vian laughed nervously. This is unbelievable. You're saying she controlled everything while pretending to be invisible? Eleanor looked at her. I didn't pretend. You just didn't look closely. The courtroom felt tight again. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Vivian, he said, did you have any legal stake in this company? Vivian hesitated. Just for a second. No, she said. But I was promised. She stopped herself again. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Promised what? Vivian swallowed. A future. Daniel shifted in his seat, his face pale. The judge turned to him. Mr. Daniel, did you make promises regarding ownership? Daniel's voice was barely audible. I may have spoken loosely. Vivian snapped her head toward him. You told me it was ours. Daniel didn't respond. Eleanor didn't react. The judge sighed quietly. Words spoken in private do not outweigh signed agreements. Vivian's composure finally cracked. So she just sits there, says nothing, and wins everything? Eleanor answered before the judge could. I'm not trying to win, Vivian scoffed. Then what are you trying to do? Eleanor met her eyes. End this. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her. The judge looked between them. Mrs. Daniel, he said, you chose not to speak earlier. Why? Eleanor paused. Because I didn't want this to be about anger. And now? the judge asked. And now, Eleanor said softly, it's about truth. Vivian felt the room slipping away from her. The awed audience was no longer on her side. They weren't impressed. They were watching, judging. Daniel leaned forward. Can we take a break? He asked. The judge shook his head. We're past that. Eleanor folded her hands again. Vivian stared at her, eyes sharp, voice low. You planned this? Eleanor's expression didn't change. I prepared for the possibility that honesty would be needed. That was when Vivian understood something she didn't want to accept. This woman had never been weak. She had simply been patient, and patience in a courtroom was dangerous. Vivian felt the pressure building in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She leaned back slightly, crossed her arms, and forced a smile that no longer reached her eyes. Your Honor, she said, this entire discussion ignores one thing. The company's success came from Daniel's leadership. Without him, none of this matters. The judge studied her. Success is rarely the result of one person alone. Daniel looked down at the table. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, unfamiliar and tired. Vivian turned to him. Say something, she urged. Tell them the truth. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Eleanor watched him quietly. There was no anger on her face, only distance. The judge broke the silence. Mr. Daniel, you have benefited from arrangements you no longer acknowledge. Daniel's voice came out strained. I didn't think it would come to this. Eleanor spoke calmly. Neither did I. Vivian laughed sharply. So that's it? She plays the quiet victim and suddenly owns everything. Eleanor shook her head. I never played a victim. Vivian leaned forward. Then what were you doing all these years? Eleanor answered without hesitation. Protecting what mattered. The courtroom felt still, like everyone was holding the same breath. The judge flipped another page. There is one more matter, he said. The trust includes a clause. Vivian's smile vanished completely. What clause? The judge read aloud. In the event of marital misconduct that places the company at legal or reputational risk, control transfers fully to the primary beneficiary. Daniel looked up sharply. What? Vivian's heart began to pound. That's not fair. The judge looked at her. Fairness is not the issue. Legality is... Daniel's voice cracked. You knew this? Eleanor nodded. Yes, and you still said nothing. I hoped I wouldn't need to. Vivian stood abruptly. So you set this up in case he cheated? Eleanor remained seated, in case he forgot who he was accountable to. The judge looked directly at Daniel. The evidence presented suggests that this clause may now be active. Daniel's shoulders slumped. Vivian whispered, almost to herself, You told me we were untouchable. Daniel didn't answer. The audience shifted, whispers spreading like a quiet wave. Eleanor took a slow breath. This was never about taking something from anyone, she said. It was about making sure the truth had a place to stand. Vivian stared at her, eyes wide. You're destroying everything. Eleanor met her gaze. No, I'm stopping the damage. The judge closed the file. This court will now consider the implications of these findings. The gavel rested in his hand. Vivian felt something she had never felt before in a courtroom. Uncertainty. The smile she had practiced, perfected, and trusted was gone. And in its place was a realization she could no longer avoid. She had never known who held the power. The judge sat quietly for a moment, reading through the documents one last time. No one spoke. Even the audience seemed afraid to move, as if a single sound might tip something fragile. Finally, the judge looked up. Based on the evidence presented, he said, This court recognizes the trust agreement as valid and enforceable. Vivian's chest tightened. The clause regarding marital misconduct, the judge continued, is clearly defined. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he folded them together. The judge turned toward him. Mr. Daniel, your actions place the company at reputational risk. Daniel swallowed hard. I never meant for this to become public. Intent, the judge replied calmly, does not erase consequence. Vivian shook her head. This can't be happening. The judge looked toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Daniel," he said, "you chose silence throughout much of this proceeding." Eleanor nodded once. That silence, the judge company continued, was not avoidance. It was restraint. Vivian let out a sharp laugh. Restraint. She waited for everything to collapse. Eleanor turned to her. "I waited for the truth to be asked." The courtroom felt colder. The judge leaned forward. "This court acknowledges that the trust clause is now active." Daniel closed his eyes. "Effective immediately," the judge said. "Control of the company transfers fully to Mrs. Daniel." The words landed heavily. Vivian's breath caught. No, that's not possible," Daniel whispered. "Eleanor." She didn't look at him. The judge raised the gavel slightly. "This decision is not punishment. It is enforcement." Vivian stood, her voice shaking. "You're taking everything from us." Eleanor replied softly, "I'm taking responsibility." Daniel finally looked at her, regret written across his face. "You could have warned me." Eleanor's voice remained steady. "You were warned, just not loudly." The audience sat in stunned silence. The judge set the gavel down. "The court will now proceed to finalize the remaining matters." Vivian slowly sank back into her seat. The confidence she had entered with was completely gone. She stared ahead, replaying every smile, every assumption, every promise she had believed. And for the first time, she understood something painful. The courtroom had never been her stage. It had been a mirror. And it had finally shown her the truth. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but the weight of what had happened stayed behind. People walked out quietly, their conversations low and cautious, as if they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Some glanced back at Eleanor with a new kind of respect. Others avoided Vivian entirely. Vivian remained seated long after most people had left. Her hands rested on the table, unmoving. The confident posture she had carried into the courtroom was gone. In its place was stillness, not calm, not dignity, just shock. Daniel stood beside her for a moment, unsure what to do. For the first time in years, he didn't have a plan. "This isn't over," Vivian said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. Daniel didn't respond. Across the room, Eleanor gathered her papers slowly. There was no rush in her movements, no victory in her expression. She looked the same as she had all day, composed, quiet, and controlled. As she turned to leave, Daniel finally spoke. "Eleanor, wait." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "I never thought you would do this," he said. "I didn't know you were capable of something like this." Eleanor took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "That's because you stopped seeing me a long time ago." Daniel stepped closer. "You could have said something. You could have warned me." She turned then, meeting his eyes. "I did. In every way that mattered. You just didn't hear it." Vivian stood abruptly. "So that's it?" she snapped. "You walk away with everything, and we're supposed to just accept it." Eleanor looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with honesty. "I'm not walking away with everything," she said. "I'm walking away with what was already mine." Vivian laughed bitterly. "You think this makes you strong?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "No, I think surviving quietly made me strong long before today." That answer stung more than any insult. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his voice low. "I lost the company. I lost my marriage. What am I supposed to do now?" Eleanor watched him for a moment. "That's a question you should have asked yourself before today." She turned and walked out. The hallway outside felt different, brighter, lighter. Eleanor paused near a window, letting the afternoon light fall across her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt no pressure to explain herself. A woman from the audience passed by and stopped briefly. "I just wanted to say, the way you handled yourself," she said softly. "It was powerful." Eleanor nodded politely. "Thank you." She continued down the hall alone. Behind her, Vivian stood frozen, replaying every moment in her mind, every smile she had worn, every assumption she had made, every promise she had believed without proof. She turned to Daniel. "You told me the company was ours." Daniel looked at the floor. "I thought it was—" Vivian's voice rose. You thought. You built my future on what you thought. Daniel didn't answer. For the first time, Vivian felt truly exposed, not in front of strangers, but in front of herself. That evening, Eleanor returned home to a quiet house. No arguments waiting, no tension in the air, just silence. This silence felt different. It felt earned. She set her bag down, poured herself a glass of water, and sat near the window. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, people rushing, cars passing, life continuing. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't open. She wasn't ready to read opinions. She wasn't interested in praise or sympathy. She thought about the years she had stayed quiet, the moments she had been underestimated, the nights she had questioned herself, and she realized something important. Her silence had never been emptiness. It had been preparation. Across town, Daniel sat alone in a dark apartment. The walls felt unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. He stared at his phone, scrolling through old photos, old messages, old versions of himself. For the first time, he saw what Eleanor had been to him. Not background, not support, but foundation. Vivian packed her things angrily, throwing clothes into a suitcase without care. Every reflection felt like an accusation. She stopped suddenly, staring at herself in the mirror. The smile she had practiced for court didn't appear. She tried again. Nothing. The next morning, headlines didn't scream. There were no dramatic news flashes. Just quiet conversations in offices, whispered comments at meetings, subtle shifts in respect. People talked about the woman who didn't argue, the woman who didn't beg, the woman who waited. Eleanor walked into her office later that week with the same calm presence she always had. Nothing flashy, nothing forced. But people noticed. They always do when power no longer needs permission. If this story is making you think about silence, about strength, about what real control looks like, take a moment to reflect. And when you're ready, share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this live longer when people talk about them. Eleanor looked out at the city once more, not thinking about revenge or regret. She was thinking about clarity and how quietly it arrives when you stop trying to prove your worth. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Eleanor noticed the difference immediately. There were no tense phone calls, no forced explanations, no need to rehearse answers in her head before speaking. For the first time in years, her thoughts belonged only to her. She woke up early one morning and sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the city stretch awake. The world outside hadn't changed, but something inside her had settled. She wasn't replaying the courtroom anymore. She wasn't reliving Vivian's smile or Daniel's silence. Those moments no longer demanded her attention. At work, people treated her differently. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with a subtle respect that hadn't been there before. Meetings paused when she spoke. Decisions waited for her input. No one questioned her presence. She didn't announce her authority. She didn't need to. One afternoon, as she walked through the office hallway, she caught her reflection in the glass wall. Same simple clothes, same calm expression. But the woman looking back at her felt complete in a way she hadn't before. Across town, Daniel struggled with the opposite kind of quiet. His phone rarely rang. When it did, it wasn't for advice or leadership. It was for clarification, permissions he no longer had, answers he couldn't give. He sat alone in his apartment one evening, the city lights flickering outside, and finally admitted something he had avoided for years. He had mistaken silence for absence. Vivian, on the other hand, felt the weight of exposure everywhere she went. Friends who once admired her confidence now kept their distance. Conversations ended too quickly. Invitations stopped coming. She replayed the courtroom scene again and again in her mind. The moment the judge asked the question. The way Eleanor answered without raising her voice. The way power had shifted without anyone shouting. She realized something painful. She had smiled because she thought she understood the game. She had been wrong. Weeks passed. Eleanor received a message one evening. Not an apology, not a demand, just a simple line from Daniel. I see it now. She read it once, then put her phone down. She didn't reply, not out of anger, but because some realizations don't need a response. Later that night, Eleanor sat at her desk, organizing old documents. Among them were notes she had written years ago, ideas, warnings, plans she had once shared and then quietly stopped repeating. She smiled faintly, not because she had won, but because she had trusted herself when no one else had. That was the part no one in the courtroom had seen. The judge had asked the question, but the answer had been prepared long before. In a quiet moment, Eleanor thought about how easily stories are misunderstood, how often loud voices dominate while quiet ones are overlooked, and how dangerous that assumption can be. She thought about how many people confuse silence with weakness. If this story feels familiar to you, if it reminds you of moments where you stayed quiet not because you were powerless, but because you were choosing your ground, then you already understand what Eleanor learned. Silence is not surrender, it is selection. Selection of the right moment, the right question, the right truth. As Eleanor closed her notebook, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom, not the kind that needs approval, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Stories like this exist all around us. They just don't always announce themselves. That's why we tell them here on Silent Queen Stories, to remind you that strength doesn't always shout, and power doesn't always smile. If this story made you think, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, do you believe silence is weakness, or do you believe it's strength waiting for the right moment? Your thoughts matter. Your voice matters. And if you stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Silent Queen Stories for more emotional, powerful stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Because sometimes the loudest truth is the one that waits to be asked.